Chapter 13. Fleeing Suspects. "Who's that? What are—" Jemmett choked. He craned his neck, and when he saw that Nancy was his new opponent, he bared his teeth and snarled, "Let go of me, or I'll do worse than this to you." Nancy's response was to twist her fingers deeper into the man's collar and tug harder. Realizing that he had an unexpected ally, Mr. Hill squirmed free of Gemmett's grasp and drove his fist deep into the innkeeper's stomach. The man doubled over with a gasp, the breath knocked out of him. Mr. Hill rose, his clothing dirty and rumpled, his face rapidly swelling with bruises. "Why, Nancy! And Carol! How did you get here?" the banker gasped. "We were here first," Nancy said. "We heard you coming, and not knowing who it was, we hid in the wardrobe." "You saved me from this madman," Mr. Hill said. "Say, did you pull up that loose plank over there?" "Yes," Nancy replied. "We were just going to look in the boxes when you frightened us off." Mr. Hill shook his head and smiled weakly. "Nancy, your father sent me back to help you hunt for more of Asa Sidney's fortune. But it was you who saved the day for me. I saw Jemmett coming from this house and traced his path to find out what he was up to. And you know the rest." Nancy chided herself for her earlier suspicions of Raymond Hill's integrity. Jemmett, clutching his middle, rose shakily to his feet. "Carol," he said, "shall I call the police and have this man arrested for trespassing?" "Arrest me!" the banker shouted. "Arrest Mr. Hill? Why?" Carol and Nancy gasped in unison. "For trying to steal old man Sidney's valuables, of course," Jemmett replied. "Why else do you think he was poking around here where Mr. Sidney used to hide his things?" "Of all the false statements," the banker bellowed. "You're the thief." "Ha ha! Deny if you can that you took a bunch of bonds from under the floor and have them in your pocket this minute," Jemmett challenged. "I don't deny it, and here they are," Mr. Hill declared, disclosing the securities. "I didn't steal them. Whoever hid them there stole them." "Tell that to the judge," the innkeeper jeered. "Old Asa hid them there himself. Come along, Carol. Both these smart crooks are trying to rob you of your inheritance. I'll drive you to town and ask for a detective to guard you, and we'll hunt up a lawyer without a smarty daughter." "No, I don't want to be with you again," Carol cried. "Go away, please, and stay away." "You'll be sorry someday you said that." Jemmett gave a forced laugh. "When these new friends of yours have stripped you of everything you own, you'll come around begging Frank and Emma to be good to you again." Nancy looked sternly at Jemmett. "How about that ebony box with brass bindings that you buried under a woodpile?" she asked. "It might mean that any visits you'll have from Carol will be in the state penitentiary." Jemmett opened his mouth as if to retort, but instead turned and walked down the dark stairs. "We must find out where he's going," Nancy said, stooping to pick up the box Jemmett had hurled at Mr. Hill. "And I'll call my dad and report to him." Mr. Hill took the box from Nancy and suggested they should also remove the other boxes from under the floorboards. They lifted them out and started for the house. "I'll give you a receipt for these and put them in the bank vault," he said to Nancy. "They certainly aren't safe here." "But the bank isn't open," Nancy told him. "It will be until 7 this evening." Mr. Hill and the girls trailed Jemmett across the meadow to the Sidney mansion. When they arrived, Hannah said he and his wife had gone to their room. Nancy nodded. "I'll phone Dad and tell him what happened. Then I'll call my chauffeur," Mr. Hill told her. She ran to the telephone booth and called her home. No one answered, so Nancy tried her father's office. His secretary was still there and explained she was working late. "Mr. Drew went out of town in connection with the Sidney case and won't be back until tomorrow afternoon," she said. "That's why he sent Mr. Hill out to see if you were all right." "Thank you," said Nancy. "We're having an exciting time, but we're all okay." Mr. Hill made his call and in a short time was ready to leave. "I think," he said, "that I'd better come back here tonight and keep an eye on things." Nancy smiled. "Oh, would you? We'll have dinner ready by that time." Carol insisted upon helping. Mrs. Gruen remarked that the Jemmets also should be offering to do their share. "They'll get hungry sometime," the Drews' housekeeper said. "Then we'll see them." Nancy had chosen to set the table in the dining room so she could watch the couple come downstairs. But half an hour went by and they did not appear. Uneasy, Nancy decided to go upstairs and speak to them. She found their door wide open and the closet stripped of clothes. On a hunch, Nancy pulled out several bureau drawers. There was nothing in them. "They've gone," she thought in dismay. No telling what they took with them. Nancy fairly flew to the first floor and burst into the kitchen. "The Jemmets have moved out!" she exclaimed. "What?" said Hannah Gruen. "But how could they without our seeing them?" Carol sank into a chair. "It's all my fault. I've made such a mess of everything," she wailed. "The Jemmets must have used the back stairway." She explained that since several steps on it needed repairing, the stairway was never used. At the top and bottom, planks had been laid across and curtains hung at the back. The spaces were used as closets. "Please show me," Nancy requested. She and Hannah followed the girl to a rear hall which opened onto a porch. Carol grasped the handle of an inside door and turned it. A curtain 3 feet beyond had been shoved aside, revealing a stairway. There was no doubt but that the Jemmets had used it in their secret getaway. "I wonder how much of Asa Sidney's property they took," Mrs. Gruen remarked grimly. Carol shuddered at the remark. "You really think they have stolen more of Mr. Sidney's possessions?" Nancy nodded. "It's a good possibility." A determined look spread over her face. "I'm going to find those people." Hannah smiled. "I'm sure nobody wants them back, but as foster parents, they did abandon a minor and are liable." "Carol, is there a big flashlight around?" Nancy asked. "Yes, in the kitchen." "We'll need it. Carol, you help me. Hannah, please guard the house," Nancy directed. The 2 girls rushed outside just in time to meet Mr. Hill walking in. His chauffeur was driving off. Quickly, Nancy explained what had happened, and the 3 rushed to the garage. As they had expected, the Jemmets' car was gone. "We didn't hear the motor," Nancy said, "so it's my guess that the Jemmets pushed the car out to the road before starting it. Let's take mine and try to catch them." She had parked her convertible in the driveway, near the far corner of the inn. When they reached the car, all of them gasped in dismay. Both rear tires had been slashed. "How awful!" Carol exclaimed. "And I have only one spare tire," Nancy said, vexed with herself because the Jemmets had outwitted her. An idea came to her. "The tire cutting was probably done to prevent pursuit," she said. "Or maybe the Jemmets wanted to make us believe pursuit is necessary, but actually they're not far away." She turned to Mr. Hill. "What was in the boxes you took to the bank, besides the securities?" "A large collection of sterling silver," he replied. "I'm sure that old tenant house is filled with loot." "Then that's where the Jemmets would go first," Nancy said with conviction. She took a large portable spotlight from her car trunk. "Let's hurry to the tenant house," she urged. The 3 strode off through the meadows to the old cottage. Nancy was somewhat disappointed to find it in darkness. "They got here ahead of us," Mr. Hill commented. "That is, if they came here at all." "Let's wait a few minutes," Nancy said, putting out the light. They stood in silence close to a towering sycamore tree, their forms blending with the light-mottled background of the trunk. At last, Nancy's keen ears heard a sound that was different from the noises of the meadow insects. It had a metallic ring and was muffled and distant. Instantly, she switched on her spotlight, and the beam cut through the blackness. The tumble-down tenant house sprang into view, and on the rickety front steps, Frank and Emma Jemmett were etched sharply in the glare. He was carrying a long, narrow box over one shoulder. His wife held a pair of ornate silver candelabra. "Call to them that the house is guarded, and that they must leave anything they have removed," Nancy whispered to Mr. Hill. "Try to disguise your voice." Raymond Hill chuckled, cleared his throat, and then in a resounding voice shouted the warning Nancy had requested. "Who are you, anyhow?" Gemmet yelled back. "I got a right to be here." "Stand where you are," Mr. Hill commanded. Gemmet gave an ugly laugh in response and moved a step lower. "If we could frighten them," whispered Nancy, "with a loud noise such as, yes." Nancy picked up a stone. "I wonder." Mr. Hill quickly sensed her thought, grabbed the rock, then with a fling sent it toward the cottage at a swift pace. There was the crash of glass as a front window shattered into splinters. Gemmet picked up the box, leaped off the steps, and ran into the darkness. Mrs. Gemmet screamed and dashed after her husband. Nancy kept the spotlight on the panic-stricken pair as they charged through the brush and meadow grass toward the road. "We must stop them and see what's in their car," Nancy exclaimed. She led the others, but the chase proved hopeless. Halfway up the road, they heard the roar of a motor and a car speed off. "I think," said Mr. Hill as the three retraced their steps, "that as soon as dinner is over, I'd better come back to the tenant house and guard it. In fact, this would give me a chance to do some more searching." Carol shyly offered an army cot and blankets from the inn. "I accept," the banker said, "and I'll take a flashlight, too." After finishing the delicious dinner Hannah had prepared, Mr. Hill left. Nancy could not get her mind off the Gemmets, and finally phoned her friend, Police Chief McGinnis in River Heights, and told him the story. "I'm glad you called me," the officer said. "This is serious. My men will be alerted to watch for the Gemmets. If they're located, the car will be searched. The sign of the twisted candles on anything they find will identify it as Asa Sidney's property." Mrs. Gruen had already insisted that the exhausted and weepy Carol go to bed. When Nancy went up to say goodnight to her, the girl was sound asleep. Nancy returned to the first floor, just in time to answer the telephone. A male voice asked, "Is Miss Nancy Drew there?" The young detective's face broke into a wide smile. "Hi, Ned," she exclaimed. "For Pete's sake, Nancy. I've been trying for days to get you. What's the idea of hiding?" "Oh, Ned, I have so much to tell you. When can you leave your job and come down so I can talk to you?" "Camp closes tomorrow. I should be home the next day. By the way, what's up between you and Bess? When I couldn't get your house, I called her to find out where you were. Boy, she was about as friendly as an ice cube." "I'll tell you when I see you," Nancy answered. "You'd better call me again before you leave, Ned. I may go home." "Okay. Be good. Bye now." "Bye." After the dinner dishes had been washed and put away, Nancy and Hannah Gruen sat down in the living room to talk. The conversation turned to possible treasures hidden in the house. "One place old-timers always hid things was in chimneys," the Drews' housekeeper remarked. "There are several in this house," Nancy said. Jumping up, she added, "Let's investigate the one in here first." Nancy brought her flashlight and looked up inside the chimney. She could see nothing because the damper was closed. Noting a hook, Nancy gave it a yank. The next moment, a shower of black soot and debris sprayed down over her. Hannah Gruen gasped. Then the next second, she cried out, "Ugh! Bats!" End of chapter 13.